Hi, I'm Jerry Deschane with the League of Wisconsin Municipalities. This is what we call the local perspective. We take a look at issues affecting local governments in Wisconsin. Today it's a big one, personal property tax. There is a significant move afoot in the Wisconsin legislature to eliminate it, get rid of it. It's a relic of the past, they say. It's horse and buggy days. And there's a huge business coalition, 24 business groups are behind the repeal of the personal property tax. I want to talk today to a major business lobbyist who is saying, oh, wait a minute here, let's talk about it. My guest on the local perspective is Tom Larson. Tom is the Senior Vice President of Legal and Regulatory Affairs?
Correct. Legal and Public Affairs.
Legal and Public Affairs for the Wisconsin Realtors. I have to disclose to folks, Tom and I have known one another for a long, long time, worked together on a lot of issues. Worked kind of at odds from time to time.
Occasionally, but together more than against.
So personal property tax, what's the realtor's position on the elimination?
Well, our members pay the personal property tax like a lot of other businesses, and it is an administrative nightmare for them, just keeping track of the various pieces of personal property, the depreciation schedules. So our members, like other small businesses, don't like the personal property tax. But our organization and our members are not in favor of eliminating it if it's going to mean a shift onto real property or if it's going to create a budget hole for local units of government. Not only are we worried about the shift aspects of eliminating the personal property tax, we're also worried about eliminating an important revenue stream for local units of government, especially with respect to tax incremental financing districts, because that is one of the key revenue streams that help pay off TIF districts. And unless that's replaced, local units of government are going to have difficulty maintaining the revenue streams to pay off those bonds.
Now, Governor Walker has made it a cornerstone of his administration that property taxes for homeowners will not go up on his watch. If they just lop it off, get rid of the personal property tax, don't come up with another revenue source, what happens to residential property taxes?
Residential property taxes will go up. Estimates vary as to how much that'll go up, but for the average homeowner, you could see it go up $60, $80, $100, and that's a significant chunk of change for most homeowners.
Okay. Well, we're going to dive into this in a little bit more detail, and I think the place to start is the basics. I sat back this morning and I thought, okay, we're talking about personal property tax, but it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? I don't pay personal property tax on any of my property in my house. So what is personal property?
Personal property taxes, personal property is the business equipment. Usually that is within an office, within a factory. It could be furniture, used to be computers until they exempted those things. It could be machinery, though in many cases machinery is exempt. It's everything inside of the building space, and it applies generally only to businesses. But there have been so many exemptions that not all personal property within a business is subject to the tax.
And I should say that Tom wrote an article for our January magazine where he talks about this, and there are something like 20 different categories of what's exempt and what's not exempt. In fact, that's one of the beefs, isn't it? That people don't really know, well, is this piece of equipment exempt or isn't it exempt? Do you know what the dividing lines are?
Yeah, I think that adds to the confusion. This laundry list of exemptions from the tax, and it makes it confusing as to which items are subject to the tax and which are not. And I don't think there is a clear dividing line or a guideline as to figuring out which one is exempt or not, which I think has created some of the confusion and animosity toward this tax by local businesses and from local officials as well. I think what I've heard is that it's an administrative nightmare for some local officials to administer and for the State Department of Revenue.
Yeah, and on the local level, I know we've talked to some of our assessors about it. And this is a hypothetical, sort of a made-up number, but if it costs $1 to bring in $100 worth of real property tax, it costs $10 to bring in the same amount of personal property. Just because for the assessors too, the paperwork process is more complicated. There's some doubt as to the accuracy of some of the assessments. I mean, don't we for the most part rely on the business owner to value that property?
And I think because of that, you have a little bit of subjectivity or inconsistent application of the personal property tax rules and depreciation schedules, because everybody may do it a little bit differently.
Okay. And if we were to eliminate it, what's the bottom line? What would the legislature need to come up with to fill that hole?
They would need to come up with a revenue source that would, I've heard estimates right around the $270 million number. Is that the latest numbers you've heard?
Yeah, that's it floats up and down, 260, 280, 290. I think last year was 270.
Something in that neighborhood. Now, you may have seen that the legislature is now projecting, the Fiscal Bureau is now projecting a surplus in the neighborhood of $320 million, $350 million at the edge of this fiscal year.
We got it. There it is, right there, right?
We have some additional money, potentially. It is a projection. Whether or not that comes to fruition, we will have to see, but it's a projection. Now, there will be 100 different ways to spend that money, but groups in support of eliminating the personal property tax are looking at that as a possible solution to address the concern about the shift onto residential.
So put your political seer's hat on for me. Is it likely the personal property tax will be eliminated, first of all, in this legislative session in the next year, and then second of all, eventually? Is the personal property tax doomed?
Well, this year I think it's going to be difficult, given the demands for additional revenue for items like transportation funding, for K-12. The governor is talking about reducing tuition for the UW system. And then you always
forget roads.
Roads, transportation, as I mentioned, and I think the Medicaid system. There's a lot of demands for the additional money. So whether or not where this is going to fall on the priority list, we will have to see. So this session, I think it's going to be difficult, but this additional revenue makes it more of a possibility than it was before.
Okay. Well, and your position, the realtor's position, is a little unique among business groups. Most of the business groups start from, we want it gone, and then in many cases they come back and they say, well, we're sympathetic to local governments. Your group has taken the position of, it isn't gone until you've got either a way to replace it or a way to protect property taxpayers. Is that a fair sort of analysis of where you're at?
That is fair, and I think we are different because, again, while our members pay the personal property tax, they represent homeowners and business owners, and the more we shift onto real property taxes, the more it is a barrier for people to purchase a home, for businesses to locate in the state, so it becomes an issue of affordability. We already have one of the highest property taxes in the country. Depending on which survey you look at, I think we're like fifth highest in the state. And as we shift more of local units of government's financial burden, finances and financial responsibilities onto real property, that real property tax burden only increases.
Mm-hmm. So, Tom, would your organization support elimination of the personal property tax if there was somehow a way found to prevent local governments from raising the tax levy? In other words, stick local governments with a $270 million hole?
We would have to look at every proposal, but our position at this point, without having a specific proposal in front of us, is to support an elimination of the personal property tax as long as it's not shifted onto real property taxpayers and as long as it does not create a budget hole for local units of government. Mm-hmm. So at this point, just from a broad sense, we would not support that.
Okay. I want to kind of divert just a little bit here. You mentioned that Wisconsin has the fifth highest property tax burden among the states. Is that because municipal governments are spending so much money, or is that because we rely too much on the property tax?
Well, I think from our perspective, and I think the perspective of most people we've spoken to, it's the latter. The property tax is the primary source of revenue for local units of government. If you look at other states, they have different revenue sources. They have sales tax revenue. They have other local options to fund local services. In Wisconsin, it's the property tax. And I think that's the key reason why we have such high property taxes. We also invest a lot in our schools, in our roads, and so forth. So we do spend money on maintaining a high quality of life, but I don't think our property tax burden is ranked 5th in the country solely because we spend a lot on services. I think it's primarily because it is the only revenue source we use.
Yeah, and that I think most local governments, excuse me, in Wisconsin would agree with that. In fact, Wisconsin is very unusual in that regard. Any idea how we got to be this way?
I am not sure of the history of it, but I suspect that there's some simplicity in keeping the number of revenue sources limited. Administering one revenue source and using the real property and personal property in general, is maybe more simple than using other revenue sources.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's one, and I want to go down this road a little bit more and talk about the tax mix and what it means to Wisconsin's economy. But before we get off the personal property tax specifically, one of the things that's troubled me, and I look at the computer aid payment as an example. They exempted computers from the personal property tax 10 years ago. Don't remember the number. And the legislature each year appropriates about $80 million that they send to local governments in the form of an aid payment to make up for that hole. You know, that was a little bit smaller hole. But the catch is, you, the small businessman, still have to do the paperwork. You still have to fill out, you know, how many personal computers you have, and you fill out the statement of value. Someone at City Hall has to process it. Is that necessary, and is that the relief we want? And I guess where I'm going with that is, shouldn't we, if we eliminate the personal property tax, shouldn't we eliminate it in such a way that the paperwork should go with it?
I think that's an excellent point. I think when you talk to most businesses, it's the payment of the personal property tax is frustrating in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But having to do the additional paperwork makes it even more so. And trying to figure out exactly what's exempt and what's covered is a big part of the problem, and I think why so many businesses are upset about the personal property tax and adamant about eliminating it.
And where I'm going with that then is, if you just simply replace it with an aid payment like the computer aid payment, you have to know how to distribute it, because the village of Stoughton, city of Stoughton, might have more personal property than the city of Evansville. And do you need some sort of an apportionment system?
Well, if anyone, those who are familiar with the school funding formula and how those dollars are apportioned, I think would be alarmed at the thought of trying to come up with an equally complex system to take into account the various degrees to which local municipalities rely on the personal property tax. Hopefully, they will come up with a simpler way that addresses some of the equity issues that you raised, because you're right, every municipality relies on the personal property tax to a different degree, and you have to figure out a way to make each of our local units of government whole.
Have you got that figured out?
Not yet. Maybe by the end of the show.
Here, I'll give you a blank piece of paper. Can you kind of sketch this out? TIF districts. What happens? Okay, let's say that we found that $300 million pot of gold. Everybody's happy. We're going to eliminate the personal property tax. If we just pulled the personal property tax off the tax bill, sent Stoughton a check for $300 million, what would that do to Stoughton's TIF district? They'd be okay, wouldn't they?
I think that's the question, is how do they allocate that money, or a portion of that money, to pay off the bonds and allocate that to the TIF districts? It's a little bit more complex than people think. I don't know how they solve that issue, but they do need to maintain that revenue stream to pay off the bonds.
Yeah, and right now the bonds call for a property tax revenue, even though it's personal property. So at a minimum, there'd be a whole lot of lawyers running around revising.
Well, I think it fits into the calculations of the local units of government when they make the projections as to when the bonds are going to be paid off. Mm-hmm. And again, that's for somebody who has much more knowledge of the intricacies of TIF and how the revenue streams are allocated among the real property and personal property. but it's an issue that needs to be addressed.
Well, you used to work with Secretary Chandler, Rick Chandler, the Secretary of Department of Revenue, probably one of the smartest tax attorneys in Wisconsin that I've ever met. Have you talked this through with him, and has he had any thoughts about what some ways to eliminate it would be?
We have not had those discussions yet. I think at this point the conversation has focused more around just eliminating the personal property tax.
Sure.
We have not been involved in any discussions about what are some alternatives to shifting it on to real property taxes. But those who are strong proponents of eliminating the personal property tax, I think that's where this is going to need to go. As you mentioned, the governor is not interested in increasing taxes on homeowners and other property owners with respect to real property taxes. And I don't think most of the legislature is either. So looking at alternatives, figuring out a different solution is likely going to be something that people need to do if they're serious about eliminating the personal property tax.
Great, great. My guest is Tom Larson, the Senior Vice President of Legal and Public Affairs for the Wisconsin Realtors Association. We've been talking up to now about the personal property tax in Wisconsin and eliminating that tax, hopefully replacing it with some sort of an aid payment or a local tax alternative. But now I want to talk about the rest of the iceberg, because the personal property tax is just one piece of this big monster that I call the local tax mix. There's real conversation in the Wisconsin legislature about blowing up the whole iceberg, isn't there? The Ways and Means Committee is looking at this notion.
The Ways and Means Committee is looking at it, and also the Assembly Republican caucus, as part of their forward agenda. One of the initiatives they have in there is taking a look at the tax mix, how we fund local services, schools, and so forth. So I think there's a real recognition that we need to look at how we fund our services. I don't know, I haven't heard the same type of discussion at the Senate level or with the governor, but at least Assembly Republicans are making that a priority.
And is this Sancho Panza and Don Quixote on the back of a mule having having a talk over a couple of beers? Packing too many things into that.
I was trying to visualize what that looked like.
Like, hey, in other words, is this a fool's errand, or is this a real conversation?
I think it's a real conversation, especially when you start looking at how people feel about the real property tax. When you look at polling done and you ask people about taxes, and which of the taxes is most onerous, which of the taxes they'd like to cut, property taxes continues to be at the top of the chart. So as the legislature, this legislature and future legislatures continue to look at ways to reduce property taxes or fund services, there is this clash between the two. And I think the public at some point is going to say, I've had enough. I've paid more than my fair share of property taxes to fund local services and our local schools. They love their schools, they love their local services, but I think they're getting exhausted of continuing to pay for those services through the property tax.
Okay. So, and we've had conversations through our lobbyist, Kurt Witinsky, with Chairman John Mako from Green Bay of the Ways and Means Committee. And I presume you've had conversations with him as well. What, in your organization's view, what are the key principles? If you blow the system up, what needs to be our guiding principles for putting it back together again? Or is blowing it up a bad idea?
Well, again, from our organization's standpoint, we want to make sure that we're not shifting any additional burdens or cost onto real property taxpayers, homeowners, businesses, and others. We also want to make sure municipalities are kept whole, so they don't have a budget shortfall or hole in their budget. So I think that's got to be one of the principles, is we want to make sure we protect homeowners. We want to make sure that we do no harm to local units of government. But I think then you have to also take a look at the entire tax mix. Have to look at which taxes we're high in. As I mentioned, we're very high with respect to other states in the area of real property taxes. And we're low in some other taxes, like sales taxes. And we're relatively high in income taxes, but I think you have to look at the entire mix and figure out what, if any, changes you'd like to make.
Now, the realtors, because your industry obviously is tied to real estate, real property, which pays the property tax, $10 billion, I think is the number of what the property tax brings in. And that's the biggest single tax in Wisconsin, is it not?
It is.
And that obviously has a huge impact on your members and their ability to do business. So are you in favor of a system that moves us away from the property tax, either entirely or in part, 50%, 60%? What? How far would you go?
Again, we would have to look at the specific proposal.
Come on, Tom.
In theory, the less of a burden that homeowners and others have to shoulder is attractive from our industry's standpoint, because property taxes are a barrier to housing affordability and the ability of people to purchase property. We'd have to look at what the alternative was, but in general, we're supportive at options that reduce that burden for homeowners and property owners.
Now, from the league's perspective, from the perspective of local governments, I think of something that Todd Berry, Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, you've worked with Todd, I've worked with Todd. For our audience, if you don't know Todd, he's a researcher who's done a tremendous amount of looking at Wisconsin's tax system. And he will agree that the mix needs to be changed. He's got opinions. But one of the things that I think the league believes would be an improvement, and Todd agrees with me, is this whole notion of connecting raising and spending. Right now, Wisconsin has this goofy system where we raise the money, send it over to Madison, they stir it around a little bit, and then send it back out, and you lose accountability along the way. I mean, we crowed about the state paying for 2/3 of local schools. And Todd said, well, that's great, but the statistics show that the more money is raised at the state level, the less accountability there is at the local level. Local governments in Wisconsin, I think every state payment, state aid payment, whether it's general transportation aids or shared revenues or recycling, over the years, the history has been the state starts off right here, and we just keep moving down and down and down as the state uses its money for other purposes. So, long way of asking you the question of, don't you think it's better to give local governments the authority to raise taxes directly?
Generally, yes. I think the taxpayers have to have some say and some control over it. And I used the current levy limits as an example. A lot of people think that the current levy limits, with the option to go to local referenda to exceed those limits, is a flawed system. And they point to the increases in the number of referenda that are passing, primarily in the area of schools, with, I think they're in the 70-75% number recently, or in recent years. The numbers for local referenda for local government spending is a little bit lower. I think it's in the 60% number. But from our perspective, there's more accountability to the taxpayer through a local referenda system, because local government school districts are making their case to the property taxpayer about whether or not they're willing to open up their checkbooks for a school expansion or for other local government services that they can see some direct impact or benefit from. So I think this idea of having more accountability, as local as you can get it, and having ultimately the property taxpayer or the citizens of the community being more informed, more knowledgeable as to where their money is going, is helpful.
Okay. Well, and let's touch on the referendum question for just a moment, because I can hear a lot of my mayors and aldermen and village presidents saying, I have a referendum every 2 years. It's called my reelection. Shouldn't we trust local officials to do their jobs, including raise and spend money, and if they do too much, throw the bums out?
I think the referendum requirement or tool is a response to this feeling that property taxes are getting out of control. And I don't think it's a long-term fix. I think it's a short-term fix until hopefully we look at this issue of changing the tax mix. But property taxes were continuing to rise, single digits, in some cases double digits, on a regular basis. And I think the idea of the levy limits with the referendum option as a stopgap measure to limit that increase. Granted, people will say that you should have local decision makers make these decisions, but property taxes continued to go up even in cases where municipalities were being very fiscally responsible, which was the case. Which was the case in most communities throughout the state. So I think some people would say local control is best served when it's when the individual property owner or citizen has more control over how that money is spent.
Mm-hmm. Well, at some point, though, we have a representative government. I mean, we can't all decide what color we'd paint our fire truck. It doesn't work that way.
Correct.
We're running short on time, but before we get off this topic, and I hope you'll come back again. We're doing this every month. What does your political prognostication say about this whole notion of changing the tax mix? Is it going to happen in this budget this spring?
I think you have to take a look not only what's going on at the state level, but what's going on at the federal level with respect to the issue of tax reform. Mm-hmm. There is a focus at the federal level to look at tax reform, and I think there's also a conscious effort to take a look at the state level. And I think you have to take a look at what impact that may have on property taxes at the federal level. If they flatten the tax and eliminate a lot of the itemized deductions, what impact does that have on Wisconsin and our property tax system? Right now, the impact of property taxes is lessened somewhat because of the ability to itemize it as a deduction. If you take away that ability, does the pain of paying the property tax become even more so? And what pressure does that have on local units of government with respect to their property tax levies? Do citizens start saying, hey, I was concerned before about property taxes, but now, because I'm no longer to deduct them for federal income tax purposes, now the level of concern has raised. I think with respect to tax reform at the state level, we'll have to look at what types of tax mixes they're talking about. But I think this issue is real at both the federal level and at the state level.
Great, and we haven't even touched on the intergovernmental cooperation that you could spur if we're not all competing for the same tax dollar. Which, I mean, the land use impacts. There's so many other impacts to this.
That was really popular in the early 2000s, talking about greater efficiencies, and that was looked at as the way to reduce government costs and control property taxes. That discussion has now shifted to the tax code and figuring out ways to lower the tax burden, and there has not been as great of emphasis placed on figuring out ways to incentivize or encourage cooperation among local units of government.
We could go on that topic, I suspect, for at least an hour, then talk about the impact on the broader economy. But any closing thoughts? We've pretty much used up our time. I'm talking to Tom Larson, one of the foremost business lobbyists in Wisconsin, about the personal property tax and views from his organization, the Wisconsin Realtors Association. Any closing thoughts or ideas?
Just one closing thought, and that would be a thank you. Thank you for the partnership that our organizations have had on a wide variety of issues, whether they're issues like tax incremental financing or property taxes or land use issues. We work together on a wide variety of issues. There are some that we don't agree on, but looking at the whole, I think there are more issues that we agree on than we don't, and we've had a close working relationship over the years and look forward to having that in the future.
Great, as do we. So, Jerry Deschane with the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, my guest, the very eloquent Tom Larson, the Senior Vice President for Legal and Public Affairs with the Wisconsin Realtors Association. This has been The Local Perspective. I think it's been a great conversation today, and I hope you found it enjoyable. We'll see you next month.